Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, we're going to be talking all about loudness targets for mastering. How loud should my master be? It's a question I get a lot, not only from mastering clients of mine, but from all corners of the internet, whether it's listeners of the SonicScoop podcast or readers of the SonicScoop site. And I have tried to address this before. In brief, in other podcast episodes, I've given some recommendations for target levels for mastering, depending on the genre you're working in. But I've never done a dedicated episode about it. So I think now is the time. We'll try to make this one super brief, and I'll front load it with some exact recommendations on what loudness levels to shoot for in mastering, depending specifically on what genre you're working in. And I'll give you a couple of spoiler alerts here. Spoiler alert number one, the proper level for mastering is generally not going to be what the streaming services recommend. What you'll find recommended by streaming services, generally speaking, most of the commercial releases that you love the sound of, that you're comparing your records to, are not mastered as quietly as the streaming services say that you should shoot for. And this can be done without having significant detrimental effects to the audio. We'll talk a little bit about that and some strategies for getting things appropriately loud without messing them up in mastering. We'll go through some broad strokes there. But spoiler alert number two is that these targets are really more ranges of appropriate loudness. There isn't one specific number you should be shooting for, and it's really going to depend a little bit on the style of production, as well as the genre, as well as your goals and what you're comparing your records to. Like, what is this record supposed to sound like? And I'll give some recommendations on that as well. And just to make sure this episode isn't ridiculously short, I'll also clarify and demystify some ideas around these acronyms that you're likely to hear in mastering. What are LUFS and loudness units and LKFS, and what's true peak level, and do I need to know about that, and why should I care? And we'll simplify that stuff and make it really understandable and comprehensible for you. All right, let's get into it. The only thing we've got to do before I give you my super secret target levels for mastering is give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. The most important sponsor on this podcast always being you. How do you sponsor this podcast? By sponsoring yourself. Check out one of our full-length courses like Mastering Demystified, which has a full module that's all about loudness and level setting for mastering, where I go into the stuff in even greater depth and give you even more practical advice on how to achieve the loudness you're looking for without messing up your masters, which is entirely possible, especially when you're starting out, when you're trying to get things appropriately loud. You can check that out with its full 30-day money-back guarantee over at masteringdemystified.com. We've also got the full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs, which I know will improve the way you mix forever for the better. You're going to find your quality and creativity go up while your time to complete each mix goes down. Is that possible? Absolutely. We've had thousands of students take this course. The before and afters I get to hear are amazing. We've got a ton of great testimonials on this one. But the best thing you can do is try it out for yourself, again, with a 30-day money-back guarantee over at mixingbreakthroughs.com, or check out the mastering course at masteringdemystified.com. All right, without further ado, let's get right into it. How loud should my masters be? Now, just to get out of the way, you've probably read on the websites of streaming services that you should shoot for -14 LUFS. What exactly is a LUFS? We'll talk about that in a minute. But as I said in the intro, that's actually way quieter than most of your favorite commercial releases are going to be. There's some exceptions here if you're talking about jazz, if you're talking about really dynamic classical music, maybe some Broadway cast recordings, they could potentially be that quiet. But most pop, rock, hip-hop, EDM, really practically any popular music genre, they're going to be a bit hotter than that. How much hotter? I'll throw some numbers at you in a second. I just want to give you some context for what these numbers mean. I'm going to give you what are called LUFS values. And LUFS, L-U-F-S, just stands for Loudness Units Full Scale. You may also sometimes see the abbreviation LKFS, which basically means the same thing as LUFS. So what's a loudness unit and what's full scale? Let's get that out of the way. A loudness unit basically compares how loud the loudest peaks are in a track to the average level of the signal in that track. So the bigger the number, the more dynamic and quieter the piece of music is going to be. And the smaller the number, the louder it's going to be, right? Because there's less distance between the average level and the peak level. So when you're looking at smaller numbers, you're looking at louder sounding material with a little bit less dynamic range in there. And when you're looking at bigger numbers, you're looking at more dynamic material, which is going to be perceived as quieter if you're playing them back at the same level. So how do you get things louder? By squashing the dynamic range a little bit. Is that bad? Possibly. You can absolutely murder some music by squashing it too much, but it can also sound kind of cool. There's a lot of genres that really lend themselves well to a little bit of dynamic range control, a little bit of compression and limiting that makes things feel a little bit more impactful, potentially a little bit more polished, a little bit more professional. And of course, you can go overboard with it until you have the exact opposite effect. So this target of -14 that a lot of the streaming services recommend, again, most records are not going to be that quiet. They're going to be louder. How much louder? Depends a little bit on genre. When we're talking about rock or popular music that has physical live played instruments in it, that stuff is usually going to be slightly on the quieter side because physical, real played instruments are often more dynamic to begin with, meaning that sometimes your compressors and limiters have to work a little bit hard on some of the hits in order for them to sound more stable. And you can hear the artifacts on them more readily than genres where you're using a lot more pre-programmed and sampled material. So I'd say for rock and pop music with a lot of physical played instruments in there, generally talking about a low of around -13 LUFS up to maybe a safe high of -10. And that's a pretty good safe range where you're not overprocessing things too much. Now, some rock and pop recordings are going to go even louder than that, and you can get away potentially with -9. Maybe even some of them are getting into the -8 range and still sounding fairly realistic and not having too much detriment done to them by the compression and limiting that's going in to getting that loudness. Of course, it is possible to push things even hotter than that, but I think you're getting out of that safe range where a lot of people are going to find that they're not making undue compromises in sound quality to get the loudness that they want. The exception there is when you want things to sound really blown up and over-processed, then you can go even louder as long as you don't care about the stuff sounding realistic or conventionally hi-fi, then yeah, you can go even hotter than that. But again, safe range, -13 to -10, maybe -9, -8, and you're still, pushing it, but if you're doing what you do really well, you can get away without too many artifacts in that general area. But things change when you're talking about music with more pre-programmed and sampled instruments. Hip-hop, for instance, can go a bit louder. I would again say that it is possible to find hip-hop records as quiet as, around -13, but it's going to be less common, and those are going to be more exceptions rather than the rule. With a lot of mainstream big hit hip-hop records, they're generally going to start a little bit louder than that. And I'd find that somewhere from -10 to -8 might be a little bit more common. So the louder end of rock and pop with a lot of physical instruments is going to be kind of the middle end of hip-hop. There are potential problems, though. Again, once you start pushing things a lot higher than -8 in hip-hop, you're going to start getting into a place where you're potentially compromising on the low end and compromising on sound quality. And this is because hip-hop in general has a lot of bottom end packed into it. And one of the dirty secrets of mastering is it's not just compression and limiting that make things sound louder and get louder, it's brightness too. And you can generally get away with more compression and more limiting with less negative effects when the material is brighter and has less low end. And the more low end you try to cram into something, the more kind of smothered and masked and gritty it's going to sound when you try to push it hard with compression and limiting. So because of the low end demanded for hip hop, you can't push it as loud as some of the very loudest genres. And now the very loudest stuff would be EDM and electronic styles along those lines can often be pushed really, really hot, where a lot of these people are mixing at -10 or -8 LUFS, and the final masters can end up significantly hotter than that. You might be finding EDM tracks that are mastered as hot as -7, -6, -5, and in some rare cases, maybe as hot as -4 before they start sounding really awful. So, just a quick recap here. Rock and pop with a lot of played instruments in them, maybe low -13 to a high of -10, fairly safe zone. Yeah, you can push it higher than that, but you're starting to flirt with disaster, or at least flirt with making some compromises in fidelity and sound just for the sake of loudness. For hip hop, maybe the levels start a little higher than that, where you're expecting things to be more like -12 to -8. But if you push things too much harder than that, again, you're going to kind of run into problems and potentially shoot yourself in the foot. EDM, electronic music, things can be louder. And I would say -8 to -6, probably much more common, and pretty common still, -5, and on rare occasions, -4. And I put out some EDM masters that sounded really good and not very distorted at -5 if you know what you're doing. And a lot of that comes down to managing low-end buildup. And that is where one of the big trade-offs in loudness comes from. At this point, I'm going to give you some extra details. Now that you've gotten the general targets for loudness, you can see it's a pretty big range. And I want to talk about two things. One, why you might want to master louder than the streaming services recommend, and why the numbers they threw out there probably aren't the best numbers to shoot for. And I also want to give you a little bit of background around some of the levels and numbers and measurements we're talking about. Now, a few practical implications here. I've just said that making things brighter makes them seem louder at the same numbers on your meter. But LUFS readings do try to compensate for this a little bit. It is a weighted measurement that tries to take into account the curves of our actual ears, where we're a little bit more sensitive to upper mid-range than we are to extreme low frequencies. We're a little bit more sensitive to high frequencies than to extreme low frequencies. And they try to put curves in place to compensate for this effect. So the readings on a LUFS meter try to discount the impact of extreme lows a little bit. So we kind of get rid of a little bit of that effect of brighter sounding louder and bassier sounding quieter at the same reading. And LUFS meters do, to a degree, compensate for this, but they don't compensate for it fully. So a big thing to recognize here is if you really do want to push things for greater perceived loudness, you can play this balancing act with how much extreme lows, how much extreme subs do you want to put in there. And the less that you put in there, the louder things will appear to people, even at the same numbers on the meters. Another thing here that you want to be aware of is there's many different ways to make a LUFS measurement. Ultimately, we're comparing how loud the peaks are to how loud the average of the signal is, but over how long of a period are you sampling that average? Is it over the entire length of the song? That might be an integrated LUFS reading that's used by some services, or is it over a relatively short time, maybe a second or two or three? Or is it really just a momentary average that you're taking that might be less than a second and comparing that to the peak? So depending on how long our average is that we're sampling, we can get very different readings on a loudness meter. A lot of these streaming services will look at an integrated LUFS reading, so kind of taking the average over the entire track and comparing that to the peak level. But you could have two songs with the same integrated LUFS reading that sound substantially different from one another. Here's just one theoretical example. You've got two tracks, both of them clock in at -10 LUFS on the meter, and they're both normalized to the same level on a streaming service. Because these streaming services do some automatic volume normalization. They take the loudest tracks, the tracks above their target, and just turn them down. So they may take a louder master and turn it down. Once it's turned down, the quieter sections in that louder master may sound louder than the quieter sections in the quieter master that didn't get turned down. So that's something important to recognize. And I think part of what plays into this effect of tracks that are mastered really quietly just don't sound as loud as tracks that were mastered louder and then turned down. But there's also other reasons. Some of the brightening that a mastering engineer might do to get to a higher LUFS reading without having a negative impact on the sound from too much bass energy, really triggering those limiters and compressors, some of that brightening may make the hotter master track sound louder as well. So it's not just about compression and limiting, it's also about overall frequency curve. Even though the LUFS rating is trying to compensate for that, it does not do it perfectly. It does it well enough so that if you're in the right ballpark within one of these target ranges, you should be pretty okay with how loud your record is. Just don't think because there's automatic volume normalization on these streaming services that it totally and completely 100% removes the need to get your average level up a little bit. As long as when you're doing it, it's helping your record sound better and not worse. People will often ask me, do I shoot for particular specific LUFS readings when I'm mastering? And the answer is no, I don't. What I do is I listen to records that my clients love the sound of, and then I listen to their record, and I try to make their record sound as good as, or hopefully better, than some of their favorite records, or at least like it belongs on the shelf with those records. And you could hear it next to those records and say, yeah, this could be on the same playlist, no problem, and it stands up to these amazingly well-produced records. My record belongs right there on the shelf along with it. And in doing so, I'm taking note of loudness, and I do try to get their record into the same ballpark of loudness as some of their favorite records. And I do not look at the LUFS reading to do that. I just use my ears. Now, that said, at the end, I'll often look at the LUFS meter and go, oh, interesting. This one came out at -11. This one came out at -6. This one came out at -13, whatever the case may be, and say, oh, that's interesting. And only if there's some back and forth with the client, in very rare occasions where they wonder, did we go too loud? Did we not go loud enough? Then I might look at the LUFS of their record and look at the LUFS reading of some of their other favorite records so we can have that conversation a little bit more precisely. But even then, there's some significant variables that make it hard to look at the LUFS readings of two tracks and imagine that's going to tell the entire story. Because again, difference in brightness, differences in section to section loudness can skew our perception of which track is louder and by how much. But it is useful to throw in there. Now, the only time that you need to be more specific is if you're a broadcast engineer and you have specific broadcast guidelines you're trying to meet for a television program or something like that. There are formats, usually formats involving picture or in contexts like radio, where you are going to have to shoot for specific loudness targets. This episode is not about that. This episode is about loudness in the context of making records, of music production. And there is no governing body that tells us how loud your record should be. And thank goodness, because records could sound great at a wide variety of levels. And there are some extremely successful recent records that have not been crazy loud on the meters. And there are some records that have been way too hot on the meters that have sounded super interesting. There have been some records that have pushed things beyond the safe zone that I'm talking about and sound super cool. Whether it's Dave Fridman mixing records for Sleater Kinney or Flaming Lips really pushing things louder than the average was for their day and making them sound interesting while doing it, or whether it's Lil Wayne, or whether it's some, EDM track that annoys all of the dynamic range crusaders, but is still extremely successful and the kids love it anyway. There can be records that push beyond this and sound cool, and that's part of their tone. And there can be records that say, hey, we're not going to play that game. We're going to play a different kind of deep listening game and go even quieter than this. And people will still love that too. And both types of records have been loved. So the bottom line here, and it's a theme that I think is quite common in this podcast, is don't be too precious about it. Try to get within one of these ranges, listen to some of your favorite records, make sure you're in the same ballpark as them, and you're going to be good. But if you need a little guidance, I think these ranges are going to help you with that. Man, there's so much more nerdy detail I could go on about around metering. And maybe one of these episodes, I should do one that's all about metering and totally nerdy esoteric stuff. But the last thing that I will say is that in addition to having a average loudness target, what your LUFS is looking at, there are peak level targets for mastering. And generally speaking, the streaming services will recommend that you go for -1 on your meters to avoid potential distortion from intersample peaks and overs. And if you're mastering really loud, they'll actually recommend you take that peak level down to -2. But once again, this recommendation from the streaming services is perhaps overly conservative and not the way that actual records that you love are mastered. The biggest goal for the streaming services in putting out these recommendations is for them to be able to say, well, we told you not to, so if it sounds messed up, it's not our fault. And that's probably their biggest goal, absolving themselves of responsibility. So Rick Rubin doesn't call up on the phone and say, you ruined my record. And they say, hey, did you follow the guidelines? And he goes, no. And they say, well, we put those guidelines out there, so, that's what we told you guys to shoot for. And ultimately, people don't shoot for that. But they get to put numbers out there that are super safe, where if you shot for their targets, you'd probably never run into a problem with their codecs really messing up and causing additional distortion to your tracks. So that is one last thing you have to be conscious of, that if you're pushing things really hot in absolute peak level, there could be digital overs called intersample peaks that don't even show up on conventional meters that can cause problems for the codec or cause problems on playback. So the recommendation there is to have your absolute peak level not be all the way up to 0. Now, there's a couple things to know about here. One, you can turn down your peak level a little bit. And I have found through trial and error that if I'm not mastering something stupidly hot, -0.4, something like that on the meters, that is often enough to totally get rid of any intersample peaks. I'll give you some practical recommendations about that in just a second, but first let's clarify this idea of intersample peaks. Intersample peaks are the idea that there are implied peaks in between samples that are actually louder than 0 dBFS, the loudest signal that a D to A converter can effectively play back. So that is potentially a problem. So simply by lowering the level a little bit, you're taking these intersample peaks below 0 dBFS, so you have much less likelihood that there'll be any distortion either in a codec or on playback. So I have found through trial and error that if I'm not mastering something ridiculously hot, just going as little as -0.3 or -0.4 will get rid of intersample peaks. And you can check this yourself with something called a true peak meter, which is a type of meter that uses oversampling to look for intersample peaks. I've also found that if I'm mastering something really hot, I might need to turn something down to as much as -0.8 or something like that in order to avoid those intersample peaks from showing up in a true peak meter. But you also might find that some small amount of very brief and not excessive intersample peaks actually won't really cause noticeable distortion to you or to others, even on playback on a consumer system. So you don't necessarily have to go too crazy trying to avoid them. Like I said, I've found that reducing things by anywhere from half a dB to as much as a full dB is more than enough to avoid intersample peaks from creating real issues in most cases. But if you want to be even more particular, you can look at using limiters that have a true peak mode, where they'll actually limit these intersample peaks as well, again, by working in an oversampling mode. And again, you can use some of these meters that have a true peak reading on them so you can make sure you don't have excessive intrasample peaks and allow you to find out just how much to turn things down. Well, I hope that part wasn't too technical and nerdy for you, but I think it's something that we had to add on to have a conversation about mastering. Although, man, I could go even more technical and nerdy on this, although I don't want to waste your time. Let me know in the comments down below. Should I go more technical? Should I go nerdy? Or was this already too long? I get both of those opinions all the time in the comments down below, so give me yours and we'll take a vote. All right, thanks again for joining me. If you do want to go into a lot more nerdy detail with even more practical advice, I do have the full-length course on mastering, Mastering Demystified, that you can check out at masteringdemystified.com. You'll learn everything that I know about mastering, with included in it a dedicated module with real audio examples going into even greater detail on this question than we just have today. There's also the full-length course on mixing breakthroughs. You can check that out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. It will change the way you mix forever for the better with a money-back guarantee. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.